Very wordy when you just read that out. Hello, I'm Bethan. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter. I'm looking at different ways to approach heritage contexts that are rooted in anti-oppressive theory, so like centering equity and better able to deal with climate contexts. So today I'm going to talk about the ways that we conceptualize nature and how that interacts with heritage and with well-being. Just terminology-wise, these are very broad terms that struggle to be defined. When I look at heritage in my research, that's kind of everything under that umbrella. So places, buildings, objects, languages, all that good stuff. I situate my work in the Anthropocene to kind of recognize the interactions between climate change and equity in that space. And then I base my methodology on anti-oppressive theory. I use that as a catch-all term with an awareness of the limitations of catch-all terms. So that's feminist theory, queer theory, anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and some beyond capitalist theory as well. So my research is in developing a framework for heritage approaches with the goal to kind of, it's not so much about critiquing other approaches. There's not one right way of doing heritage, but proposing a different methodology, a different pathway that is based around these anti-oppressive texts. So these like texts I use, these writers writing anti-oppressive theory, they're not heritage texts, they're not well-being texts, they're by a wide range of people, kind of from the 20th century as well as the 21st, looking at power, looking at systems of minoritization and oppression, and looking at ways of knowing and interacting with the world that have historically been sidelined by kind of mainstream Western heritage approaches. So from those texts, I draw key themes that can be applied to heritage contexts, one of which is nature. So it's kind of situating the presentation. So the question with nature is, how can changing dominant conceptualizations of nature suggest different heritage approaches? So how is this all tied up with well-being? So we know that well-being and heritage are entangled with each other. That's why we're all here. These big concepts that are universal in that everybody has them, but specific in that they're enacted differently in people's lives. And that's really kind of the focus, is bringing it back to people, how these are embodied through people and their like social contexts and their physical contexts. And we talk, of course, about how heritage and heritage experiences affect people's well-being. With my methodology of kind of using anti-oppressive theory as foundational, I'm like entangling well-being right there at the beginning as kind of a guiding tool for heritage theory and practical approaches. And then talking about nature today, so this is a non-comprehensive kind of list of how a lot of well-being conversations think about nature. So the primary one there is like nature as of benefit to people, kind of as a resource sometimes. So thinking about, that's typically kind of green spaces and like undeveloped nature. We also see discussions of like human nature, an idea of being true to our natures, whatever that might mean. And then also exploration of well-being as something physical, so as something that goes through the body. I see that as tying into ideas of nature because it's an integration of the physical self. But when I'm talking about nature, kind of in my framework and in my presentation today, it's kind of taking it back and saying, well, what do we mean when we talk about nature? How are we conceptualizing it? What boundaries are remaining? And there's been a lot of exploration in various fields and definitely in heritage about this kind of nature-human relationship. But what ways are we not looking at it? And how does that intersect with heritage and with well-being? And the way I do that is by looking at this anti-oppressive theory, which ties in really neatly with well-being kind of at this beginning stage, because they have a really closely connected relationship, because well-being work recognizes how experience of the world is intersectional, is different for different people. It's different within communities, between communities. It doesn't look the same everywhere, and it has to be addressed holistically. And part of that is the structures and systems that support people's well-being in terms of their rights, their political like emancipation, all those kinds of things. So well-being work should aim to work anti-oppressively, and using anti-oppressive theory as this foundational kind of tool in my framework centers well-being right there at the beginning. So I'm now going to talk you through actually what my framework suggests to do with nature and kind of how this connects to ideas of well-being. Just as a reference point, when I do that, the well-being, specific well-being connections I'm drawing out are from these 3 frameworks. I'm not going to go into them today, but just if anybody is into that kind of thing, this is where I'm drawing those from. Okay, so pulling from anti-oppressive knowledge to suggest approaches to heritage contexts and how that connects to well-being. So lots of anti-oppressive writers identify kind of this dualistic pattern of thought, this like Cartesian Enlightenment system, as culturally and temporally specific. So it's not a universal way of seeing the world. It's not a way that everybody sees nature as distinct from human. And so we can look forward into heritage approaches and say, what does it look like if there is no distinction between humans and nature at all? So all human behavior is natural. So heritage is natural. It's natural animals doing something natural in the world. And this connects to well-being ideas of how important it is to live in relation to the world, to other species and to ourselves and to other parts of the world around us, rather than separating ourselves out. And it's recognized that this dualistic pattern is not just culturally specific, it's also harmful in lots of contexts. So the nature kind of culture dichotomy has been used to animalize people. It still is in certain contexts. So some people are more human than others, some people are more animal than others. So moving away from that as part of addressing the inequalities that have been part of various heritage traditions in the past. And this ties to well-being ideas of the importance of equality for people, respect and rights and so on. Then in anti-oppressive knowledge, I've also pulled out an awareness of how capitalist and colonialist projects require disconnection from place. So in order to turn places into resources, whether that's like resources under the ground or animals or plants or even people, there needs to be an idea that the population is separate from the place, and therefore it doesn't matter what you do to the place, you can use it because people are not connected, they're not integrated into that landscape. So a counter to that kind of mentality, which is a big contributor to like climate change and various inequalities, is a whole systems approach. So looking at places altogether, saying we can't separate out people from place, we can't separate out heritage from other aspects of a landscape or an environment or a context. And this connects to well-being ideas of the fact that our well-being is not separate from the world around us. So ecosystem health and that kind of thing affects us. And then looking at how the body and emotion have been recognized within lots of anti-oppressive texts as really significant sources of power and thought. And that is, again, breaking apart another dualism, this kind of like emotion, reason dualism, to say that actually the body is a really powerful place of resistance and engagement, and recognizing that everything we do is mediated through our physical existence. So that's for heritage, saying that heritage includes emotive and bodily experiences, tying to well-being ideas of the kind of importance of our physical selves for our well-being and how that's all kind of integrated together. So these are kind of the theory. I'm aware it's like quite a lot of text on the screen, but it gives you an idea of how the theory in my framework develops. And then what I do in my research is some kind of deep dive case studies. I don't have time to go super deep into any of these today, but what I am going to do is just show some heritage approaches that are suggested by this framework and by some of these proposals that might like fit with different contexts that you're familiar with or different ones you see over the next couple of days. So answering the question or addressing the question, kind of how can we move outside of the human nature kind of system, is thinking about things like site categorization. So of course, famously with like UNESCO, but also kind of if you've got a site that has archaeology and you've also got kind of a biodiversity plan, are they being managed entirely separately? Or how do they interact with one another? How do those features of a place actually depend on one another? And can they be managed more holistically? Thinking about how recognizing ourselves and our heritage as nature alters responses to threats. So this is connected particularly to how climate change has kind of exacerbated and identified some of the kind of falsity of traditional preservation approaches, the idea that you can't actually keep everything the same and you can't keep it forever. And that's experienced in lots of places as a stress and as a threat. But if we think of ourselves as natural and our heritage is natural, that kind of integrates ideas of change, of birth, of death. And so we're looking at something that kind of is always changing. So how does that shift our perspective on future changes and how we might manage things iteratively rather than trying to lock in solutions forever? Then thinking about kind of the political and the activist side of things, kind of being unable to disentangle people's heritage from the rest of their lives, either functionally and also ethically. So heritage as a kind of political force, which I'm aware some people would rather be, kind of avoid politicizing it, but I think it's always political. So how is that directly addressed, and how can heritage work alongside different causes, different organizations, things like environmental justice, climate justice, land rights in various parts of the world? How is that all integrated together? And then finally, thinking about the body again. So how can the body actually be integrated into heritage contexts? And this is in terms of visitors, but also kind of in terms of decision-making as well. So the most obvious one there is things like museums, this idea of some senses being absent from heritage contexts, particularly like touch, which is connected to how we want to preserve things. So what does it mean to actually welcome people's bodies more into an environment? How could they be integrated into experience? And also in terms of people decision-making and managing places, how are our emotions integrated into those practices? And what might that look like? So this has been like very whistle stop, but hopefully it gives you kind of an idea of some of the threads of my research. And I'd be happy to kind of explore more specific contexts at the end or in the next couple of days.